On Thanksgiving Eve, 1971, a man in a dark business suit walked up to a ticket counter at Portland International Airport and paid $20 in cash for a short flight north to Seattle. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. He was calm, unremarkable, somewhere in his 40s, with the kind of face that 100 witnesses would later struggle to describe with any confidence. Nobody in that terminal had any reason to look twice at him. By the end of that night, his name, misprinted by an early news wire as D.B. Cooper, will belong to the only unsolved skyjacking in American history. And more than 5 decades later, a case everyone assumed had gone permanently cold is suddenly, quietly, moving again. Here's what actually happened that night, stripped of the myth that's built up around it. Cooper boarded Northwest Orient Flight 305, took a seat near the back of the cabin, ordered a bourbon and soda, and lit a cigarette. Somewhere over Oregon, he passed a note to a flight attendant. She assumed it was a phone number and tucked it away without reading it. A small, human moment of boredom that nearly delayed the entire case by minutes. When she finally opened it, the note was simple and precise. He had a bomb in his briefcase, and he wanted $200,000 and 4 parachutes waiting when the plane landed in Seattle. He never raised his voice. He never threatened anyone directly. He tipped the crew. He seemed, by every account from the people trapped on that plane with him, almost apologetic about the whole thing. A professional handling an unpleasant piece of business. When the aircraft circled Seattle for 2 hours while the FBI scrambled to gather the ransom, Cooper sat quietly, watching the rain streak the window, sipping his drink like a man waiting for a delayed connection. On the ground, agents assembled $10,020 bills and did something that would matter enormously decades later. They photographed every single serial number before handing the money over. Once the plane landed and the exchange was made, 36 ordinary passengers walked off into the terminal with no idea they'd just spent 2 hours sitting near a man about to vanish into American folklore. Only the cockpit crew and 1 flight attendant remained aboard. Cooper's instructions were specific and crucially technical. Fly toward Mexico City, stay under 10,000 feet, keep the landing gear down, set the flaps to 15 degrees, and leave the rear air stair, the fold-down staircase built into the tail of the Boeing 727, unlocked and operable. That last detail told investigators more about him than almost anything else recovered that night. The 727 was one of the only commercial jets of that era, with a rear stairway that could be lowered mid-flight. Knowing that wasn't common knowledge. It was a kind of detail you'd only know if you'd studied the aircraft closely or worked around one. The plane took off a second time near 7:40 that evening, banking south into a freezing rainstorm. The crew, sealed in the cockpit under Cooper's orders, felt the aircraft shift slightly around 8:13 p.m. A dip in the tail, a change in pressure, the sensation one pilot later described as a plane briefly curtsying to something. The warning light for the rear air stair blinked on. Somewhere over the dense, roadless forests of southwest Washington, in freezing rain and wind chill plunging towards 70 below, a man with $200,000 strapped his body and a parachute on his back stepped out into the dark and was never seen again. When the plane landed in Reno, agents found the rear cabin empty, the air stair hanging open, and almost nothing left behind. 2 of the 4 parachutes were gone with him. What remained was a scattering of cigarette butts, a few strands of hair on the headrest, and draped casually over a seat, as if he'd simply forgotten it, a narrow black clip-on tie with a cheap faux pearl clasp, the kind sold by the thousands at JCPenney. Nobody in that cabin could have guessed that an ordinary $1.50 necktie would one day become the single most important object in the entire case. The manhunt that followed was staggering in scale. Soldiers swept the forest floor in long, disciplined lines. Helicopters worked the treetops. Boats dragged the rivers and reservoirs below the presumed drop zone. The FBI, reasonably, assumed they were searching for a body, not a fugitive. A man leaping from 10,000 feet into a winter storm wearing loafers and a business suit, with no helmet, no jump goggles, and a reportedly non-steerable canopy, had almost no realistic chance of surviving the landing, let alone the exposure afterward. And yet the wilderness gave back nothing. Not a scrap of parachute silk. Not a shoe. Not a single one of those marked $20 bills. Nothing. That absence is what turned a violent felony into a folk legend. A country exhausted by a decade of assassinations, scandal, and an unpopular war fell a little bit in love with the idea of a man who robbed an airline without hurting anyone, tipped the crew on his way out, and beat the system with nothing but nerve and a plan. Bars named drinks after him. A small Washington town still holds an annual celebration in his honor. But the FBI wasn't in the business of romance. They were in the business of serial numbers. And for 9 years, those numbers simply refused to surface anywhere in the world. Then, in February of 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian, digging in the sand along the Columbia River to build a campfire, pulled up a decaying, rubber-banded bundle of cash. When agents ran the numbers, they matched the ransom exactly. Nearly $6,000 of it, all beginning with the same series letter photographed 9 years earlier. It was the first hard, physical proof that the case wasn't purely theoretical. But the location made almost no sense. The money surfaced miles from any of the calculated landing zones, and geologists who studied the sediment around it couldn't agree on how it had gotten there, whether by river current, by dredging, or by Cooper himself. It was a kind of discovery that should have narrowed the mystery and instead multiplied it. In the decade since, the FBI has run down more than 1,000 names. There's been an ex-paratrooper whose resemblance to the sketch made headlines for years. There have been multiple deathbed confessions, each accompanied by a grieving family convinced an old tie or a faded photograph proved their father or uncle had lived a secret life. None of it has ever held up against fingerprints, timelines, or hard forensic comparison. What the case has never lacked is suspects. What it has always lacked is proof. Which brings us to the tie, and to what's actually new about this case right now. Because something genuinely is. For decades, that clip-on tie sat in an evidence locker as a curiosity. But a necktie worn against the throat all day collects things. Sweat, skin cells, stray fibers, microscopic dust that a person carries to the world without ever noticing. In recent years, researchers working with independent investigators examined the tie under a scanning electron microscope and found something unexpected trapped in its fibers. Particles of pure titanium, along with stainless steel, aluminum, and rare earth metal traces. Some fused together in ways that suggested exposure to an industrial or manufacturing environment rather than casual contact. In 1971, titanium wasn't something an ordinary office worker brushed up against. It was aerospace-grade material, used in the same industries building the very aircraft Cooper hijacked. That single detail reframed decades of assumptions. For years, the profile of Cooper had swung between two extremes, a desperate amateur who got lucky, or a trained military jumper executing a flawless plan. The metal particles suggested a third possibility that fit the evidence just as well, if not better, an insider. A man comfortable around jets not because he'd parachuted out of them in combat, but because he may have helped build them or worked the floor of a plant where they were assembled. It would explain his eerie familiarity with the 727's mechanics, his knowledge of the rear air stair, his calm handling of an aircraft most passengers never think twice about. Investigators are careful to say this evidence is suggestive, not conclusive, and that honesty matters here. A person can pick up titanium residue by working with the metal directly, by borrowing contaminated tie, or simply by standing near the wrong workbench once. It narrows the range of possibility. It doesn't hand anyone a name. The DNA side of the story is where things are genuinely more current, and also where the most caution is required. The tie has been handled by dozens of people since 1971. Agents, lab technicians, evidence clerks. Every person who ever opened that envelope. Any genetic material recovered from it is almost certainly a tangled mixture of multiple people's DNA, most of them investigators rather than Cooper. Researchers have, over the years, managed to pull partial, degraded, incomplete genetic profiles from the tie's least handled areas, like the knot and inner folds. Those partial profiles have never been made public in full, and by the FBI's own past statements, comparisons run against specific suspects' families have not produced a confirmed match. Two names currently sit at the center of the renewed attention. One is Richard Floyd McCoy, II, a Vietnam veteran and Army helicopter pilot who, just months after the Cooper hijacking, carried out a strikingly similar skyjacking. Same demand structure, same use of 727's rear air stair, same parachute escape. McCoy was caught, convicted, escaped custody, and was killed in a shootout with law enforcement in 1974. For decades, his family refused to cooperate with DNA testing. That changed recently, when his son came forward and agreed to provide a cheek swab, reportedly hoping to finally settle what his mother believed for years, that his father was Cooper. Even the investigator who pushed hardest for that DNA test has publicly said he thinks the odds of McCoy actually being Cooper are close to zero, largely because eyewitness descriptions and behavioral details from the flight don't line up cleanly with McCoy's known profile. The other name is Vince Peterson, a metallurgist identified to the titanium particle research and floated as a suspect by independent investigators in recent years. Peterson worked in exactly the kind of industrial environment the tie evidence points toward, and some circumstantial details about his life and movements have kept his name in circulation. His own family has pushed back, noting he had no known parachuting experience or documented history of financial windfalls after 1971, which, given that not one marked ransom bill has ever surfaced tied to a specific person's spending, remains one of the case's most stubborn contradictions no matter who the suspect is. So, where does that leave the title of this video? And the honest answer is, still short of confirmation. As of now, no DNA test has produced a verified, publicly confirmed match between Cooper and any named suspect, including McCoy or Peterson. What has changed is that, for the first time in years, there's active forensic work happening, a real DNA comparison underway with the McCoy family, and a real, peer-examined analysis of trace particles from the tie that has genuinely narrowed the profile of who Cooper likely was. That's not nothing. In a case that spent decades accumulating false confessions and dead ends, having two independently derived leads pointing loosely in the same direction, an aerospace-adjacent insider, tested against a real genetic sample, is further than this investigation has gotten in over 50 years. It's worth sitting with why this case has resisted an answer for so long in the first place. It isn't because Cooper was a criminal mastermind untouchable by modern forensics. It's because the physical evidence is thin, contaminated, and half a century old, and because nearly every lead that emerged has come from people who wanted, understandably, to believe their father or uncle or neighbor was capable of something extraordinary. Memory is generous that way, especially near the end of life. A deathbed confession carries emotional weight that no lab result can match, which is exactly why investigators have learned to treat every single one of them with the same careful skepticism, no matter how convincing the family certainty sounds. The skeptics in this case have a fair point, and it deserves to be stated plainly. A titanium particle could have come from a workplace, a borrowed jacket, or a contaminated evidence bag over 50-plus years of handling. A degraded, partial DNA profile pulled from a tie touched by dozens of law enforcement personnel is nowhere near strong enough, on its own, to convict anyone in a court of history, let alone a courtroom. The FBI itself suspended active investigation of the case back in 2016, not because it was solved, but because the trail had gone cold enough that continuing to actively pursue it wasn't producing results. Extraordinary claims about identifying Cooper have surfaced roughly once a year for the last decade. Almost all of them have quietly evaporated under closer scrutiny. What we can say with confidence is this: the titanium particles are real, and they were examined and published by legitimate researchers. The partial DNA profile is real, and the McCoy family's decision to finally submit a sample is a genuine, current development, not an old rumor being recycled. The insider theory, a man who understood jet mechanics because he worked around them, not because he jumped from planes in combat, is more credible today than it's been at any point in this case's history. None of that adds up to a name. It adds up to the best chance this investigation has had in 53 years of finally getting one. Somewhere in an evidence room, that tie is still sitting in its envelope, still holding whatever fragments of a stranger's life got caught in its fibers on one rainy night in 1971. Somewhere, a lab is still working through a DNA comparison whose result hasn't been made public yet. And somewhere, quite possibly, there's a family that doesn't yet know their relative once stepped off the back of a Boeing 727 into a freezing storm and simply kept walking for the rest of his life. So here's the honest question we're sitting with. If this case is ever actually solved, do you think the answer will be someone dramatic enough to deserve the legend, or someone so ordinary that it makes the whole thing more unsettling? Tell me who you think it is in the comments, and whether you think a 55-year-old Thai can finally give this ghost a name.